Good afternoon. Now, a few weeks ago, somebody wrote in with a question about the saliency of serpents in Hindu and Nordic culture. Now, everybody knows a few things about this, and unfortunately, those few things can wind up eclipsing everything else. So, we'd like to present a bit of a re-evaluation, if you will, for the snake, the serpent, and indeed the dragon in Indo-European culture and mythology. Now, to start out with, let's address the big preconception, the serpent in the room, if you will. Most of the time, when we think of serpents, we tend to think of them as being malefic or evil creatures. There's two reasons for this. The first one is entirely legitimate when it comes to the Indo-European sphere. The fundamental chaos kampf, as it's known, between the striker or thunderer deific on the one hand, and a serpent, demon, dragon, those sorts of creatures associated with water and the hoarding of on the other. We can name half a dozen of these sorts of encounters off the top of our head quite often. So, for example, we have Indra against Vritra, or we have Hercules against the Hydra, or we have Thor fighting Jormungandr. There's also a related typology wherein the Sky Father, the striker or thunderer's father, in fact, takes on such a demon as well. So, for example, Brihaspati fighting Vala, or Zeus fighting Typhon, you get the idea. Now, this is not to say that this typology is wrong, or that it shouldn't be something which comes up in your mind when thinking about snakes or serpents. Completely not the case. It's not incorrect, it's just incomplete. What we're looking to do here is show that in Indo-European terms there's another side to serpents as well, particularly because the blanket condemnation of all serpents as being malicious is effectively an Abrahamic coloration of our views. So if you think about serpents, often one of the first things that people will think about is, of course, that famed serpent in the Garden of Eden, or Satan taking on a serpentine form elsewhere, a dragon form in the Book of Revelation, and so on and so forth. In any case, let's look at some of the actual mythology. Now, we were asked specifically about Hindu and Nordic mythology, so we're going to start out with the Nordic side of things. Now, as I've said, there are some bits and pieces that everybody knows. For example, the thing around eyesight, which we'll be getting to, and there's some bits and pieces that fewer people know. So we're going to start out with addressing this other side that is less frequently remarked upon, and that concerns the serpent not as being a demon or a chaotic force, but actually quite the opposite, an upholder of cosmic law. The best example that I can think of off the top of my head for the Nordic mythology is the one in which Skadi, or Skadi, I suppose, there's that DTH sort of double sound, is charged with the punishment of Loki. Now, the way in which she does this is very interesting to us, because what she does, per the attestations which we have in the Gylfaginning and the Lokasinna, which of course is quite relevant for obvious reasons, is she imprisons Loki underground and has a great serpent who is dripping venom into the eyes of Loki. It's a pretty sort of dire punishment when you think about it, because Loki, of course, is not going to die, and so therefore for an eternity has this venom of the serpent dripping into his eyes. So as we can see here, the serpent is being used as a punishment. It is a scourge, if you will, in the sense of a great whippy thing. Now, this is not something which is just restricted to Loki. It is also an expression of a broader Indo-European typology, as we'll address when we come to the Erinyes in a moment. One brief point before we go on to the other Nordic example, that Skadi element, as we've discussed elsewhere, the etymology appears to connect it to shadow, shade. So what we effectively see is this black avenging form of the mother goddess, as you also see with Kali, as you see with Demeter Erinyes, and she's carrying out this act of sanction using a serpent, as we'll say, we'll address that in a moment. Now, in terms of some further examples of the serpent being used in this underground, or underworld, we should say, context as a sanction, we can quote the following verses, which come from, I forget which source actually, I think it's the Gylfaginning. It's the Philosopher, I should say. A hall she saw standing, remote from the sun, on dead body shore, Nastrond. Its door looks north. There fell drops of venom in through the roof vent. That hall is woven of serpents' spines. She saw there waiting onerous streams of men perjured and wolfish murderers, and the one who seduces another's close trusted wife. There malice striker, sucked the corpses of the dead. The wolf tore men. Do you seek to know? and what. So as I said, that's from the Voluspa, I should more properly say. Now, what's being described there is a portion of the Nordic underworld, in which, as we can see, various men who've carried out various sins. So we find men who have been murdered, sorry, not been murdered, men who have murdered, we should say. Men who have murdered, men who have done general sort of malefic acts, men who have stolen the wives of other men. We've got some stuff on that in a future episode, perhaps. And other people who perjured themselves, broken their oaths, wind up in this particular underworld realm, which is characterized as a building with the walls being made out of these serpents intertwined, and with a very particular serpent, Nithorgr, a name which means, hewer would be a cognate for the Hogger particle. Nith is an interesting particle for a number of reasons, but it effectively means, sin, sort of a darkening of their soul through the sinful conduct, which is, so Nithorgr is gnawing upon, is hewing these creatures, these men, we should say, to use the term loosely, who have carried out acts of sin. As we can see, the serpent is here upholding cosmic law. Now, there's a slight exception with regard to Nithorgr in particular, because yes, once again, there is a bit of a duality going on. So if we address in, say, the, one moment while I bring up the relevant sections, if we address in, say, the Grimnismal, which is the famed poem in which Grimnir, Odin, the masked one, is setting out the various kernels of wisdom about the cosmology of the Norse, we shall quote, "More serpents there are beneath the ash than an unwise ape would think. Goin and Moin, Graf Vitner's sons, Grabak and Graf Voleth, Ufner and Svafner, shall ever, methinks, gnaw at the twigs of the tree." Sorry, my pronunciation's gone a bit sideways there. Gnaw at the twigs of the tree, we should say. Yggdrasil's ash great evil suffers, far more than men do know. The heart bites its top, its trunk is rotting, and Nithorgr gnaws beneath. So, as we can see, there's one potential way you could interpret that, with Nithorgr actually being one of these serpents who's also gnawing upon the limbs of Yggdrasil. Now, Yggdrasil, as we've previously discussed, is the saliency of cosmic law in our universe as the axis mundi. However, there's another way you could interpret that verse, the second verse, I should say, whereby it's a general sort of positional statement, whereby Nithorgr is gnawing, indeed, upon those sinful men down the bottom at the base of the world tree, rather than being gnawing upon the actual roots of the tree. I'm not going to take a position on that, you could argue it either way, but I just think it's interesting to raise and address both sides of this, and potentially explore that other resonancy. Certainly, we have this general attestation elsewhere via the situation of Skadi for serpents acting in that other manner than what we would perhaps immediately think of. Now, I'm going to branch away from the Nordic mythology here, and we're going to take a bit of a look at what happens in the Greek. Now, you might think that the notion of serpentine or draconic creatures in the underworld is an Abrahamic thing. It is not. In fact, it's one of those situations whereby it would appear that a lot of the Christian mythology around the eschatology, the underworld, that sort of side of things, has actually been ported over from the Indo-European world. In fact, in some of the more archaic Christian texts, the actual term utilized to refer to the underworld is stuff like Tartaros, which of course nobody's ever heard of before outside of Greek mythology, and of course hell. Well, hell is directly Germanic, but I digress. Now, the following bit that I'm going to read out in translation, and I'm only going to read a small bit because even in translation these things are powerful, is from one of the Orphic hymnals to the Eumenides, which is basically the furies, we might sort of say, who of course punish acts of sin. Now, where are we up to here? "Unless with these you readily conspire, and far avert your all-destructive ire, the boundless tribes of mortals you descry, and justly rule with right's impartial eye. Come, snaky-haired, fates, many forms divine, suppress your rage, and to our rights incline." Now, there's two parts to that. The first one is the snake hair element, which of course is this snake association for these punishers of the sinful. The second element, because we're going to keep rethreading this thread, so to speak, through the eye of a needle, you might say, is the eye element, right's impartial eye. That vision saliency is going to be vitally important in a bit. Now, the next Orphic hymnal, once again, we'll only quote parts of this. We find the Eumenides, the Furies, being described as being born of a conjunction, we might say, of Jove, Zeus, Chthonios, so the underworld Zeus, the underworld Jupiter, born with Proserpine, that is to say Persephone. So, as previously discussed, Hades is an expression of the Sky Father. Persephone is his wife, reigning death, as we previously titled her, to translate rather directly the Athenaeum. And what we find is they have, once again, to quote, these lovely locks adorn, whose piercing sight, with vision unconfined, surveys the deeds of all the impious kind. So, ... because we're not going to quote this in full due to the power. Dark-coloured queens, whose glittering eyes are bright with dreadful, radiant, life-destroying light. Once again, ... fatal and horrid to the human sight, with snaky tresses wandering in the night. So, once again, as we can see, a strong saliency for both A, vision, eyes glittering in the darkness, and B, those snaky tresses, as the poem puts it. You can see how the typology works. That's described in the Furies, as we sort of said. And of course, also that dark, that shadowy visage, which we previously encountered with A, Skadi, but also B, that brief mention for Demeter Erinyes, who we can, of course, describe as being one of the foremost of this Erinyes sort of clade. There's some further complications with regard to Demeter and Persephone that we'll address at some other point, because it is quite interesting. But in terms of further attestations outside the Orphic corpus, Nonnus's Dionysiaca, he would see the serpentine image of the goddess of Tartaros, i.e. Erinyes, and leap up scared at the many-coloured vision of the spectre. Or Statius's Theobald, Tisiphone rouses from her infernal abode her companion Megaera, and her kindred snakes to battle. She muttered into the earth the name of the absent one, her sister Erinyes, and raised aloft a horned serpent from her hair with long-drawn hisses. Once again, you can see the clear pattern which is going on here. Now, in terms of the Hindu sphere sort of expressions of this, we do, of course, find serpents in the underworld, Nagaloka as it would be called, and we also find the serpents being associated with the punishment of the violation of cosmic order. In particular, the Brahmahatya personification, which is again black, shadowy, and a female visage which is horrifying, and pursues those who have carried out the most egregious sin of killing a Brahmin. Well, once again, it's serpent associated in various sorts of texts. There are other elements which we could draw from to flesh out that typology, but we've addressed that somewhat elsewhere, so we'll move on. Now, one point which I do wish to raise here is that in this cosmological understanding of the serpents as guardians of order, the serpent actually shows up as a guardian of the local order, we might say, the small o order, of the household and home. So, for example, the Lithuanians have their concept of a serpent which lives under their house, which they leave out offerings for. It's a spirit of the house which is propitiated. This, I believe, to be an archaic Indo-European understanding, because if we consider, for example, the situation of the Acropolis of Athens, what we find there in the Erechtheion is a spirit of a serpentine forebear, an ancestor in serpent form, that is living in the crawl space under the temple. In fact, if memory serves me correctly, and it often does, there is a situation previous to the Erechtheion whereby a similar construction was actually understood to be sort of in place before the Persians had burned it down when they occupied the Acropolis during the Persian-Greek War. But again, it was a situation whereby a serpentine ancestor was held to be a guardian for the territory in question. Now, of additional interest to us is actually that this custom of, I suppose you might say, serpentine guardian elements may be what partially informs the situation of Athena herself being referred to as a dragoness, a Drakaina, in the relevant Orphic hymnal to her. We also find elsewhere in the, I'm just going to bring this up to make sure I get it completely correct. We also find in other texts a bit of a double up when it comes to the utilization of hora or hore, which is to say, literally the things being done at the proper time. So it comes up in terms of the seasons of the spirits and natural order, we might say, being utilized to hail the Scythian dragon, Drakaina Scythia, elsewhere in various texts pertaining to these sorts of things, which is a very interesting duality because we also find occasionally people trying to connect the Scythian dragon to the Echidna, sort of a chaotic demon. So this understanding in the classical world for a progenitor dragoness, a progenitor serpent for the Scythian race, actually having this order understanding attached to it. And similarly, the draconic understanding for Athena is vitally important because it's that other side, it's that more positive side, which links not only to cosmic order, but to the goddess, that is the in-universe expression of cosmic order, per not only the wonderful theology of Sayana, the wonderful Vedic commentator, per Devi, the voice, you might say, the goddess of sacred speech, but also it turns up via Frigg being the closest connected to Orlog in, again, that Locusena, but also, who is it, Lucretius, I forget the name of the work, but he talks about Magna Mater, the Great Mother, being once again directly correlate with cosmic order in its in-universe expression. So, very interesting for a number of reasons, but we should probably move on. Now, in terms of the situation of eyesight, the reason why I made a point of referring to it isn't simply because it shows up frequently with those Erinyes. Rather, the reason why I thought it was very relevant to talk about is because the actual etymology for, now where is it in my notes? The actual etymology for dragon, drake, and those sorts of terms comes directly from, oddly enough, sorry, I should correct myself there. One of the senses for drake comes from the relevant Proto-Indo-European. The other sense for drake, funnily enough, actually comes from Proto-Indo-European hreg, which means king. Obviously, this is a term for rulership. But in terms of regularity, we should say, regulation. But in terms of cosmic order enforcement, once again, but in terms of the other understanding for drake, the one that's actually rather more intrinsic to dragon and related terms, drakain, we should say in ancient Greek, the term which imputes it is Proto-Indo-European dirk, which means to see, which of course informs Sanskrit darshana, which means theophany, so when a god or goddess appears to you, that is darshana. And, well, what to say about that? What we have there is a situation whereby a serpent and its eyesight, a dragon and its eyesight, are quite closely correlated. Now, this shows up in the, I suppose we might call it the, in the Rigsthula, when it's talking about the essential characteristics of various clades to the Nordic caste system, if you will, there's a thing talking about the defining markings of the Jarls. The Jarls, of course, earls, we call them in English, being the nobility, you might say, the warrior aristocracy. Although, as I've also pointed out, and others have also pointed out before me, Erlaz appears to mean a rune carver, so there's a priestly understanding for it as well. Anyway, to mispronounce the Old Norse, and the way I often mispronounce the Old Sanskrit, Otul varu, augu sem irmlingi. Now, the irmlingi bit effectively means a young or a small worm, a young or a small serpent or dragon. What it effectively means to translate is flashing his eyes like the serpent's shone, or flashing his eyes like the young dragon's shone, in terms of the infant Jarl who's being sort of held and acknowledged at that particular time. So, an essential characteristic of this ruling caste member, the Jarl, is that his eyes shine. As we have seen with regard to those Erinyes situations, I shall just pull up the direct bit and piece with regard to that. Ah yes, so from the Orphic hymnal in question, dark-coloured queens, whose glittering eyes are bright with dreadful, radiant, life-destroying light, eternal rulers, terrible and strong, to whom revenge and tortures dire belong. So as we can see, and once again there are an array of attestations for this sort of concept tree, this notion of eyesight and the dragons, the serpents, with rulership is quite heavily correlated. Now, my belief as to why this is that the eyes, windows to the soul, as somebody once said, they actually connote the possession of a strong ability to see things as they actually are. And a penetrating gaze enables you to see behind the lies and prevarications of somebody who's trying to mislead you. It's an essential characteristic for somebody who's in a rulership position, especially if they're going to be carrying out sanctions upon other people. We might actually suggest, therefore, that the situation we encounter with the Locusena and Gylfaginning, wherein Skadi is carrying out this particular punishment with serpent's venom upon Loki, the venom drips into his eyes. It's one of those ironic punishments which we're so frequently finding in the Indo-European mythopoetic concept tree. No ruler him. But in terms of other dimensions to it, the serpent or the dragon is often famed as having secret wisdom. That's partially why they're so powerful. So therefore, that glittering of the eyes, etc., it connotes this wisdom, this treasure of the mind, so to speak, and power, which can be taken from them, or can be embodied, we might say, to the appropriate man, whether that's by drinking dragon's blood, in the case of a certain Germanic hero, or, we might suggest, whether it's by turning into the dragon themselves. Now, this is not to talk about Fafnir in a positive sense, by no means. What I'm instead seeking to suggest here, we find in various Indo-European mythopoetic concepts the Sky Father becoming a serpent, adopting a draconic form. So, for example, Odin does exactly this when he's carrying out his effort to find the mead of poetry. It's you can regard it as potentially being somewhat metaphorical in that context, but then every myth has its symbolic elements. The serpentine form is chosen for a good reason, in other words. We also find, and it's rather lesser known, but it is there, a serpentine form for Lord Shiva, one of the Rudras, Ahira. Now what this means, and I apologize once again for the egregiously mispronounced Sanskrit, is Ahira means serpent or dragon, Budinya means of the deep, of the depths. It's this idea that there's a great big serpent down the bottom of the world, so to speak, whose attentions may indeed be very wrathful, but at the same time, it's a Rudra, it's a form of Shiva. So as we can see, there's some multi-layered conceptry going on there. Now, in terms of this rulership thing, one of the sine qua non requirements for a ruler is, as we discussed, dispensing justice, but also protection. Protection against the demons, the monsters which may come from without. So the question we should have is there a guardianship saliency to this situation as we've seen? And yes, as we've already set out, there's very much a guardianship saliency for the serpent which we should also address. In terms of the Hindu sphere elements, you actually find exactly the same thing in terms of a serpent being a guardian. The reason for this, in symbolic terms, is because if we consider the cobra, when a cobra is threatened, it doesn't slink away. It rears up with its hood. It flares out and it says, I'm going to stand my ground with no legs, quite impressive to do, and I'm going to flare out and protect this thing that is under my protection. This is partially why you'll occasionally find, and one of my associates actually did this, introduced a cobra nest under a temple that was being reclaimed in order to protect it. But you occasionally find exactly those sorts of things of the serpent being utilized as guardians, whether symbolically or directly literally. In terms of the situation of the serpent about Shiva's neck, it occasionally has the same guardianship saliency. It rears up, it strikes out at somebody who might be sort of attempting to threaten the great god, who the great god is not going to deal with personally. Funnily enough, as applies that particular situation, there appears to be a certain level of saliency. Sorry. Now, where is this Celtic thing that I'm looking for? Right, the Irish hero of Conall Cernach, or Cernach. I'm sorry that I'm mispronouncing the Gaelic there. In that particular situation, he had a serpentine belt which did effectively the same thing. Now, he'd acquired this belt because it was a previous guardian of a fortress which was held by cattle raiders. So, as you can see, there's potentially a bit of that, well, not necessarily mixed, but a situation of that guarding and warding thing because it's associated with this previous fortress. But this notion of the serpentine belt, whether it's about the waist or about the neck, acting in guardianship, we can once again see how it links together. Now, to dial back just for a moment, in terms of the empowerment side of things, that wisdom side of things, we find the Kundalini serpent in the Hindu sphere going up the spine, which we could potentially link to the axis mundi, as many people have attempted to do. In that particular context, the Kundalini serpent is not a demon, or a demoness, we should say. It is Shakti, it is a feminine serpent. The rising up is empowerment. And in terms of what we've earlier said about a sort of goddess form that is intimately correlated with cosmic order, well, you can see how it, relatively speaking, fits together. Now, in terms of, I should stop saying in terms of, is there anything which we have left to sort of address in these sorts of sides of things? Nope, I'd have to say that's pretty much it. So, just to briefly run through via synopsis about everything which we've discussed. The serpent is often regarded as being a negative, malefic, or demon thing. That's partially due to the influence, yes, of Indo-European myths where this is completely the case. However, it's also due to an Abrahamic influence which therefore colours our perspective and tends to mean we only see this negative side of things with no room for the positive. What we actually find when we're looking at the broader Indo-European mythopoetica, scripture, and theology around this is that the serpent, quite apart from being always a demonic creature or a serpentine, cosmic chaos agent, is often in fact correlated with cosmic order, cosmic law. It is there, partially, in those positive instances, to uphold cosmic order, punish those who violate it, and also represents considerable power indeed as a general conception around rulership. So we've explored that reg situation, that Jarl caste thing, and of course the draconic code, we might sort of say, in terms of the Greek, and of course the divine associations, not only with the mother goddess, but also with the Sky Father having that serpentine form. And there's some other Greek examples that we won't get into at this particular point in time. So those rulership angles, those protection angles, and it finds itself expressed, as we've said, not only via those Sky Father elements, but also via these serpentine avenging forms, like the Erinyes, like Skadi, Demeter Erinyes, other forms like that, who are acting to uphold cosmic order against wrongdoers, against those who are seeking to undermine the saliency of cosmic order in this universe of ours. Now, that is a bit of a duality when it comes to the serpent, because some of them are obviously, as we saw, gnawing upon Yggdrasil's bowels, and therefore weakening cosmic order's saliency in this universe of ours, whereas others are protecting it. Interestingly, often the female serpents that are protecting it, which strikes another blow against those people who keep insisting that female divinity or female spirits have to axiomatically be chaotic. It's simply not the case. It's quite the opposite. It may be the case in Mesopotamia, when you've got, sort of Tiamat and things like that, and it may be very convenient for the likes of Jordan Peterson, or whatever his name is, to talk about a feminine chaotic dragon thing. But actually, as we've seen, in the Indo-European sphere, it's exactly the opposite way around quite frequently. In any case, there is an expression in Sanskrit which I often quote. It's dharma rakshati rakshitaha. Now what this means is dharma, protected, protects. Rakshi, rakshati I should say, it basically means, guardianship. So raksha means sort of a guardian, etc. This is partially why the series of buns upon my arm, the red ones which you can see, they're also known as rakis, because of course they're partially tied, because they're an atpat rapek, a warding amulet, you might sort of suggest. At least these ones are, because they're properly blessed, etc. Now, in terms of how we might innovate with regard to this, a maxim which I potentially would be able to use is sarpo rakshatiya rakshitaha. Now, sarpo is directly cognate with serpent. Sarpo means snake in Sanskrit. So, sarpo rakshatiya rakshitaha would mean the serpent, protected, protects. With that in mind, therefore, and because it's Friday, Jai Mata Di.